Well, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. We have Webster Griffin Tarpley, who's an author and historian who joins us from Washington, and also President of the Middle East Research Center, Richard Hellman, who also joins us from Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. I'll first start with you, Webster Griffin Tarpley. Set the stage for us and tell us if you think that there's any doubt that these Paris terrorist attacks is a clear example of blowback due to France's war on Syria.
I think you can call it blowback, but it's a little bit more complicated than that in the sense that the ISIS, essentially, or Daesh, or ISIL, the Islamic State, the Caliphate, call it what you will, this grew out of a complex counterinsurgency program that was launched by military commanders of the U.S. after the invasion of Iraq, which was, of course, a catastrophe and a crime. But they decided that they would try to split the Iraqi people by fomenting what they called at that time the Anbar Awakening, or the Sunni Awakening, which simply meant that they would bribe various ethnic groups in Anbar province and other parts of Iraq to go and commit atrocities against Shiite mosques or schools or neighborhoods, with the idea of fomenting a civil war. So there was a civil war, but it was, in many ways, artificial. Now, fast forward to today, I would say by about August of this year, it ought to be clear, I think, when the U.S. was able to put 4 or 5 or 6 fighters into the field after $500 million of expenditure in a program, what it showed is that the U.S. control over these groups has essentially evaporated. And we've now got other people coming in to take control of ISIS or Daesh. And this would mean, above all, Saudi Arabia, they pay the money, and they finance the entire thing. Their networks, the institutions that they fund, draw in recruits. And then, of course, we have Turkey. And the general opinion of people whose judgment has been shown to be accurate over recent years is that, in effect, Erdogan of Turkey is the operational boss of ISIS. I mean, he is Mr. ISIS. People in the West have a hard time with that, but I think that's the case. And Erdogan also has his son, who is the head of the oil smuggling traffic, which has been in the news lately. So what we've got now is the force of public opinion, the intervention of Russia and others, is forcing Western governments to at least be seen to be doing something about ISIS. And of course, they've got to compete, right? If they don't keep pace with Russia, they will lose face to Russia. So there's another thing. So I would say the prime suspects in this Parisian tragedy are, of course, ISIS. Yes, indeed, ISIS. But ISIS understood now as under the influence of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, perhaps some other groups. And, of course, there are Western intelligence factions, right? There's this Petraeus-Allen group that is always talking about how valuable ISIS is, or people in MI6, or inside France, right? Inside the DGSE and other agencies, there's a faction that likes for these things to happen, right? They've been incapable of stopping them. Going back to Mera, going back to Charlie Hebdo, and now today.
So let's see what Richard Hellman thinks. Richard Hellman, sounds like the U.S. policy in the lead, along with the countries that have followed U.S.'s lead, have failed when you look at the severe consequence of it, and that is what is playing out in the streets of Paris.
Well, I disagree with most of what your other guest here in Washington has said. All of his intricate conspiracy theories coming back to basically blaming America and others. ISIS or Daesh is an indigenous terrorist group whose attacks have no justification and no support from America or from France or from any other nation that values that has any human values. Now, I do believe that America lacks a coherent Middle East strategy or policy, and has lacked that ever since President Obama was elected, and perhaps before. And yes, the second Gulf War unleashed a lot of forces that are still contending for Iraq and across the border for Syria. But the United States needs a coherent Middle East strategy or policy, so it's not just hit and miss diplomacy and other actions. And I do believe that the UN Security Council must meet urgently and must have a strong coalition of forces of the UN Security Council under Article 7 to bring all the forces in Syria under control, to have an immediate ceasefire, to stop the killing, and to institute a process by which Syria can be reconstituted with a truly legally elected democratic government, which they have not had under the whole history of the state. Tehran rules Assad of Syria, of Damascus, and now Russia is helping him as well. And it really is unclear how the Russian forces interact with ISIS, or whether they are just killing other free Syria opposition forces, and whether Russia and France, who now seem to be forming some kind of a de facto coalition or alliance, can be brought into line with the other members of the UN Security Council to stop the fighting, stop the killing, stop the mass emigration of refugees that has caused so many problems, and reconstitute a viable Syria, in fact, a better Syria, which for the first time in modern history will have a government that really is elected by the people, not a president for life like Bashar Assad and his father before him. I think this is indispensable, and since the White House has not seemed to be able to articulate or produce a coherent strategy or a policy for Syria, or for the Middle East for that matter, I believe that it's time for the U.S. Congress to deal with this. The President asked for an authorization to use military force earlier this year in February against ISIS. The Congress did nothing on this. Congress must come back and pass a law, a veto-proof majority law that could even override a presidential veto, which builds upon all the mistakes of our conflicts, the U.S. conflicts, since World War II. And arguably, most of our conflicts since then have violated, excuse me, I'm finishing my sentence, they have violated the lessons that were learned in World War II and the lessons that have been learned from Vietnam and Korea and so forth. Only the first Gulf War obeyed most of those lessons that were learned, and therefore it had the success of restoring Kuwait to statehood after Saddam Hussein's invasion. We need to go back to solid foreign policy and a solid strategy so that we know what we're doing, we know how to achieve it, and we have reliable allies on a broad basis that can produce a better Middle East and a better world. Well,
it's interesting that you stated in that context that you have to go back to a solid foreign policy. So you're saying as a consequence, you ruined Iraq, not you personally, but the U.S., who was supposedly you know, in the forefront there, but then a backseat role in Libya. And I'd like to go back to the Iraq war, Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, and then follow through with the war in Libya, and then follow through with what happened with obviously Syria, and the interim in Iraq, in terms of how the U.S. came into those countries, and then pretty much has left those countries in tatters, and let the violence persist. For example, Libya. We don't see after the war on Libya the U.S. really doing anything, or their allies, to try to rebuild that country. And if we want to take a look at Iraq, the same. Iraq went through a period, which is still going, lots of deaths on a daily basis, and yet you don't see much reaction. I'm trying to connect these dots here as to see why there has not been this proactive interference, if that's what they wanted, to stop the violence, and yet now they're saying that after these wars, this is the case of blowback, such as what's happening on the streets of Paris with the Paris attacks.
The attack on Libya, I would say, is somewhat less the responsibility of the United States. I think if you go back and look at Libya, you'll see that the Sarkozy government of France and his advisor, Bernard-Henri Lévy, BHL as he's called, they were out in front, right? The first bombing was done by the French, and it was actually based on a secret treaty between Britain and France, which had been put together in late 2010, that they were going to attack a large country in the Maghreb, right, in North Africa, and that was, of course, Libya. And unfortunately, at that time, the Medvedev government in Moscow did not veto it, which they should have done, and indeed China should have vetoed that, so it could not have gotten through the UN Security Council. So this, of course, was the wanton destruction of a very well-functioning country with, of course, an authoritarian government, no doubt about that. But now, when you look at hell on earth, when you look at chaos, when you look at mayhem in the streets every day, you'd have to say there is a lot to be said for maintaining law and order and keeping some kind of an orderly society. Now, if we go to the current situation, the root of the problem with ISIS, at least in the last year, is a guy called General John Allen. He is the ISIS czar, or was the U.S. ISIS czar. And he was brought in by Kerry and approved by Obama. Obama always very weak in these things, except that Obama does have this instinct to say, let's not have a new Vietnam, let's not have a new Iraq, let's pull back at that point. But the Allen policy was simply this: phony war, appeasement of ISIS. Send out planes, few of them, no targets, they drop the bombs or don't drop the bombs, and they come back. A complete farce. And this is what has attracted the scorn and the rage of the world, that for one whole year, 14 months, the United States was pretending to do something against ISIS and simply didn't do it, because this Petraeus-Allen clique and their tentacles in the military said, no, we don't want to do that. You got to realize the people in Langley, Virginia at the CIA and at the Pentagon, they regard ISIS as a CIA secret army, which they can use. They can use it against Iran. They can use it in Central Asia against Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, or, top target, against Russia in the Caucasus, Transcaucasus, places like Chechnya or Dagestan, and so on down the line. So there's a tremendous resistance in the U.S. military by some groups against doing anything to really deal with ISIS, to clobber ISIS. Now, right now, things are changing, and the Russian intervention had a lot to do with that. So now we've got a situation where, if you listen to Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry on Sunday, he said it's time for the United States to work together with Turkey to close the ISIS supply lines, because ISIS is not a phantom. It's an army. It travels on its stomach, just like Napoleon always said. So they have supply lines, right? The stuff comes in from Turkey. It's organized by the Turkish military and Erdogan's family personally, as we said. So they've got to get ammunition. They've got to get refined gasoline. They've got to get medical supplies, food, and above all, recruits coming in. There is a gap in the Kurdish control of that border, right? If you look at the Turkish-Syrian border, you'll see that just west of Jarablus on the Euphrates River and going over in the direction of Efren and places like Aleppo, there's about 100 kilometers where this traffic is going back and forth. That's the aorta of ISIS. And the obvious thing to do is to cut those supply lines. If you do that, ISIS will wither on the vine. It will collapse within a matter of weeks. All these crazy stories we hear that ISIS are supermen with magical powers, right, and it's going to take decades to defeat them. It's all baloney. The town of Sinjar was taken last week in 24 hours by the U.S. and the Kurds. So that could be done all along that border. That would be the end of ISIS.
Very well. Hold on to your thoughts, and I know you have a reaction, Richard Hellman. Let's take a listen into some of our viewer comments as posted on our Facebook page, and we'll get right back to the topic of the debate.
This is really good news. The more countries go against Daesh, the better. But one thing people have to realize is that Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, IS, Wahhabis, Takfiris are not Muslims and in no shape or form represent Islam. Do you think Europe and America with their big army could not kill 15,000 terrorists before if they wanted? No doubt, Paris attacks and the crisis of refugees are only the first steps in a Gladio operation in Europe. In order to increase the security budget, you must have terror. To destroy the middle class and the state of welfare for good, nothing better than thousands of refugees to join the unemployed. If inside the refugees arrive also terrorists, we have the whole package Gladio. I think the West created all of this with their double standards and warmongering.
Okay, those were some of the viewer comments there. Richard Hellman, if I may just ask this question before you have a reply. This takes me back to when not only Ray Odierno, but also David Petraeus stated just about a year ago, saying that we're looking at a 30-year war against ISIL. Now, I can't imagine for the life of me figuring out how somebody in that position, which is part of supposedly the biggest and strongest army in the world, can even look down that far, but yet make a statement like that, that the U.S. has 30 years to fight the ISIL. It sounds like there was some kind of agenda behind maintaining ISIL, which only the end result being destruction as we've seen it. Now you go ahead with your reaction to Webster Griffin Tarpley.
Well, I can't agree with or give credence to the conspiracy theories that Tarpley has advanced, or what you've said about General Petraeus and others. I agree that statements like that make no sense, but I think it is not, it is more a policy vacuum or a lack of a coherent Middle East policy and strategy on behalf of America, or for that matter, the West or NATO, so that we know what our objective is there. And I think the objective of all, and it's come through in some of the comments that you relayed from the social media, but I think that most honest, reliable Muslims, Christians, Jews, other people of good faith want stability in the Middle East so that minorities like the Christians and Yazidis and Kurds and others are not being slaughtered by the terrorist forces such as ISIL, or for that matter, by Hezbollah or the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps that's fighting Bashar al-Assad's battles, as Russia is doing. We need a coherent strategy. We need a policy, and if the White House can't come up with one, as seems to be the case, the Congress must act to put the principles that America stands for in a law, in an authorization to use military force, but only as the last resort, and also to respect those lessons that we've learned from these prior conflicts since World War II.
I got to jump in and give Webster Griffin Tarpley a chance to speak. And Webster Griffin Tarpley, Richard Hellman talks about how Hezbollah and Iran are causing some of the mayhem where they're fighting Iran in the advisory role. They're fighting these ISIL terrorists. Tell us overall how you think this is going to go, especially tell us what you think when the Secretary of State John Kerry says that a ceasefire could be just weeks away. And this is after the Paris attacks, and before that, he wouldn't have that assessment.
I would say it is inconceivable to leave large areas of territory under the control of this genocidal cult called ISIS. This is simply out of the question. You can't have a ceasefire in place that leaves all of those millions of Syrians and Iraqis under the control of this monstrosity. I get the impression that the people who are interested in the ceasefire have seen that ISIS is losing. ISIS is a paper tiger. ISIS is getting clobbered. They lost Sinjar. My reports are that in the area of Aleppo to Palmyra, the Russian bombing and desertions by deluded and disappointed fighters have meant that we can look for a collapse, at least a partial collapse in the ISIS position between Palmyra and Aleppo sometime during the winter. We've got that air base that has been taken over. It was besieged by the rebels for a long time, and now the Syrian army is back in there. The Iraqi army is encircling Ramadi. So ISIS is getting
unfortunately got to come in. We're just fresh out of time. Thank you very much for that. That was Webster Griffin Tarpley talking to us, our author and historian from Washington. Also from Washington, we had Richard Hellman talk to us as president of the Middle East Research Center. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Tavway, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. Goodbye.